My dad walked in on me making out with his best friend and punched him until he passed out. My dad was angry. I knew if he had a gun on him, he would have shot Mack right through his chest, uncaring of the fact that it would have landed him right in jail. I understood his reaction to some extent, but he had misunderstood the situation. Half of his anger came from the belief that Mack had been, forcing himself on me. Mack was leaning against the wall, his broad hand covering his face to shield himself from any more punches from my dad. Honestly, knowing my dad, I knew there was a good chance that he wouldn't stop if provoked anymore. "I trusted you," my dad seethed, looking at Mack. It's not what you think, Arthur," Mack replied. And not for the first time. I'd lost count of how many times he had confessed the same thing. I stood in the corner for a while in complete silence before pulling my dad's attention to me. I had been silent until now because I knew my half-naked self would provoke him more. I didn't want to do that. Not when my dad was still holding the bat in his hand. I could see blood on it, and I knew a few more wrong words, and he would definitely take Mack's life. "Dad, he didn't do anything." "What the hell do you mean he didn't do anything? Right when I first met him, I knew he didn't look like a good man. His heart was never in the right place. I trusted you with him, and this is what he did? He tried to assault my son? I will kill him." "He didn't," I replied, before he could move again. "What do you mean, Nick?" "He wasn't forcing himself on me, Dad. It was consensual." The blood drained from his face. "What do you mean by that?" "We have been dating," I replied, my voice tiny, scared, and fragile. Suddenly, I imagined myself as the quiet, nervous 7-year-old watching his parents fight with each other. It always ended brutally, and I wasn't ready to be a witness to that again. We have been dating a while. I wasn't sure continuing the years would be a good idea, so I kept mum about that. "This was consensual. I wanted to kiss him." My dad seemed disgusted now. "He is 42, my dad growled. He turned to Mack. "Have you been grooming my son, Mack? I have known you for over a decade. How long have you been doing it?" "Dad," I rushed to answer, but he shushed me. "I want him to speak." He pointed at Mack. Mack was in no position to answer. I could see him trembling with pain, even from this distance. Even then, he pieced words together. "Some years," he replied. "Today's our 6th anniversary." And I knew that was the wrong thing to say because even before my dad raised his bat again, I knew it wasn't going to end well. Sometime later, "The moment he wakes up, take your stuff and get out of this place. I don't want to see either of you anymore." I didn't dare look up into his eyes. Mack was still unconscious. Although I had cleaned all his wounds by now, he looked in pain, and I was very close to calling an ambulance. "We will be out of your hair. I promise, Dad." He didn't reply. He just kept pacing up and down the room, not once looking at the mess he had made of his son and best friend. "I know it's bothering you, Dad," I began. "But I promise we have been very careful. I wasn't a kid when we started dating, and it was a mutual decision. He loves me as much as I love him." "It'll do you good to keep your mouth shut, Nick." I set my lips in a hard line and didn't say anything. He needed time, and I didn't want him to rush through his feelings any more than he already had. When he glared at me some 10 minutes later, I knew he was probably thinking back to the moment when he found us very close. It happened at his birthday party. Mack and I were drunk and careless. We'd sneak into a room to kiss, and then I heard my dad calling for him. I'd pushed Mack off me, but we were still very close. When my dad asked what we were doing there, Mack had replied that I wanted someone's opinion on his latest boyfriend, and that I believed Mack would be the best option to discuss it. My dad hadn't looked like he believed it. Now I'm sure he hated me for deceiving him. And I was right. "You're my only son," he began, his voice sounding on the edge. I was upset at myself for being the reason behind it. I have done everything in my power to ensure you have a good life. And what have you done? I did not care if you're gay. I did not care what career you chose for anything. But dating my colleague and best friend, Nick? Couldn't you find another man to date? No, I replied, hating myself for the answer. What do you mean, no? I mean that... I stopped and bit on my bottom lip. It was my last-ditch attempt to keep my words to myself, but I knew it was a futile effort when the words came out anyway. After Mom's death, you were absent. Mack was the only person available. He'd listened to me when you refused to even acknowledge my grief. He stood by me when I finished college and started my job. You were absent, Dad. He became my friend then. It was only natural for me to fall in love with him. My dad was so stunned he didn't say a word. When Mack finally woke up, I asked if I could stay with him for the night. Without even caring for my dad's reaction, he asked me to follow him. I drove us to his place, and my dad not once said anything to stop either of us. At least, I knew the peace would come late. After that, we decided to go to the hospital anyway to make sure nothing was serious. Sometime later. Don't worry, Mack began, as if he could understand or perceive my anxiety. And if he could, then that wouldn't be very surprising. He knew me like the back of his hand. I'll tell him that I got into an accident, or that it was a very bad classical case of pickpocketing, he shrugged. You don't have to worry, really. It's just, I began, wiggling my fingers together, that saying that wouldn't solve any issue. What if Dad does something? It wasn't like I didn't trust my dad, but I had never left him in this state either. It was valid of me to worry about that fact. If things got out of hand, or if he felt like he had been deceived so much that he couldn't control his anger, he knew where Mack lived after all. He wouldn't, Mack replied, though he didn't seem very inclined to believe his own words. But honestly, Nick, Arthur's reaction makes perfect sense. We were drunk, and it must have appeared that I was taking advantage of you. If I'd found my son like that with an older guy, well, I would have probably done the same. He stopped and then huffed out a sardonic laugh. And it is hypocritical of me to say that, honestly. After all, I am doing the same. I ignored his latter confession and focused on the other part of his statement. It wasn't like I didn't want to discuss it, but we had moved long past that over the years, or at least I had hoped we had. But you weren't, I protested. Sure thing, but how could your dad have known? I went silent. We were drunk, and it must not have looked very good to my dad. Besides, Mack was his best friend, and I was his son. God, how could I forget the most problematic thing about our relationship? Over the years, this was one of the few things that we often discussed and simultaneously feared. It's all right, Nick, Mack said. I'm all right. He wasn't, but I wasn't going to say anything to make him more worried. He had enough on his hands as it was. I grabbed his hand and drove the rest of the way to the hospital. I could only hope I didn't get caught for a drink and drive. That wouldn't end well. When we returned home an hour later, Max said that he wasn't hungry and would immediately go to sleep. I reminded him that he still needed to take his meds, and so I cooked something light for him. Because his hands were weak after, well, everything, I had to feed him. Not something that I hated, but the reminder of how it all came to be was disappointing and upsetting. I will take off tomorrow, I said. Why would you do that? Mack asked, and held my free hand. I can manage, I promise. It's just that I don't really think I can face anyone, honestly. After everything, I think I need a lie down. Okay, Mack replied. That sounds good. You can do that. Are you going to the office tomorrow? I asked and placed the now empty bowl on the bedside table. He cringed and made a face and then winced with pain. I think I should avoid your dad for a while. We both laughed at that. Please don't ever hit him back, I cautioned some half an hour later. It was past midnight and I knew I wasn't going to wake up before 10 tomorrow. I needed the sleep, I was pretty sure. Of course not. I will not touch a hair on him. I placed my head on his chest and thanked him. I am sorry, I said next, for everything. I should have said something to him or told him about us like you wanted. It would have saved us from so much trouble. It would have saved you from all that. Beating? He provided, and then gave a small gruff laugh. I knew that he was sleepy. Yeah, I replied. It would have saved you from all that beating. Well, he softly murmured, even though it hurts, I don't mind getting beaten for you. I nearly poked him on his bruised cheek. You did not mean that. Well, I hope that I don't have to get beaten again, but you get the gist of my statement. You did, right? Warmth flooded my chest and I couldn't help but grin lying there. A few days later, Mack and I just returned from a musical festival the evening my dad found us kissing. The festival was, well, a little boring, but it was something. And I had managed to convince Mack to come along with me. And that single fact made the evening so much better than I'd initially imagined it would be. When we'd left the show, we'd found ourselves in the bar some 30 minutes away from it. We drank, kissed, and left for my house with every intention to spend the night in my bedroom. But, of course, Dad happened and he found us in a very compromising state. It made sense he was so enraged. Plus, as Mack kept repeating, it was his best friend I was with. But, in certain ways, our relationship was perfectly justified in my eyes. It had to happen sooner or later. I still remember when Dad had first invited Mack to our house for dinner. He had introduced him as a colleague, but I'm pretty sure he's climbing up my list of good friends very fast. And Mack did. Before the year ended, the two were spending a lot of time together, and it was because of that that I often met Mack. It was also because of that I developed a liking for him. When my mom died and my dad became your typical absent parent post a tragedy, it was Mack who served as my anchor. Then the college happened, and then my latest list of boyfriends, and Dad was absent through it all. In fact, I had grown accustomed to his absence. I had grown comfortable in his absence. Even though it stung that he had kind of forgotten to live in the present for his still alive son, but it wasn't the same for Mack. He listened to me. He was handsome and he was kind. It wasn't a big surprise to me that I had developed a massive crush on him. Before either of us knew it, I was looking for ways to have his attention on me. Then one day, it finally came. I remember when I'd first seen you like this, I murmured as I changed his bandage. Mack was sitting against the cushion, and some 70s rock music played in the background. But he looked sleepy and exhausted, though still handsome. It looked like he'd aged several years in the past few days. I once joked it was probably because of the best friend's separation, and I was sure even my dad was going through it. Actually, no. It was worse then. Yeah, it was pretty bad. I'm sorry, I replied, though it didn't matter at this point. It had been 6 years since, and I was pretty sure Mack probably didn't even remember the whole thing. I did, though, and I remembered it really well. Eric was my latest boyfriend before I finally hitched with Mack. He was, in the simplest words, brutal. When I finally told him that I didn't want to date him anymore, it got him angry. It made him so upset that he raised his hands on me, and when I needed help, I called Mack before I called my dad. I wasn't sure why I did that, but I didn't have a lot of time to ponder over that when Mack showed up some 10 minutes later and saved me from the whole fiasco. Of course, it didn't end well for him. Why do you keep apologizing for something you had absolutely no control over, Nick? I had told you it's all right. It's in the past. Let it stay in the past. He didn't sound annoyed, but I still felt like he was chiding me, and well, I needed it in a way. Several people in my life had poked me mercilessly about this habit of mine. I shrugged. I just feel guilty, all right? You don't have to feel guilty about anything like that, Nick. You know, I'll never blame you for them. I would never. He brought his uninjured hand and rubbed his thumb between my eyebrows. I relaxed immediately, and he gave me a small smile. How about we go out to eat today? Will that cheer you up, Nick? In your state? No. I am all right, he insisted. And honestly, I need fresh air. I'm tired of being cooped up in this place. I will drive, I said. He made an amused face. I do not trust your skills, but all right. I can let this go for one time. I rolled my eyes at him, and he jerked back with a small laugh. Had he forgotten I was the one who drove him to the hospital a couple of days ago? A few days later. I met Arthur today at the office, Mack said, and leaned against the counter to watch me cook dinner. It went well, he added before I could ask how it went. I mean, not that we talked. He didn't stop throwing daggers at me, and I saw him sitting in the furthest corner of the cabin all alone. He wasn't talking to anyone. Everyone thought I'd done something, but he never said a single word. Not to anyone else, and definitely not to me. Nick, he said inside. He looked like he had aged a decade. I'm worried for him. I am more worried for my dad than you are, Mack, I replied, and slapped his hand away when he tried to sneak some pieces of pancakes. It wasn't ready, and I didn't like anyone eating when the food wasn't ready. It was like an itch. No matter how many times I tried to stop it, it wouldn't stop. Stop acting like a child. He gave a small laugh. You make it hard for me. I make it hard? I laughed. You're so caring, he said. You're more caring to me than I am to you, and no, you cannot deny that. I don't know if it's because you're a teacher and hence being caring is part of your nature, but it just checks out so well, you know? Nick, I'm glad I know you, and I am lucky that you love me. I couldn't help but smile at him, struck by the genuine words. Which also means, he said, and rolled his tongue against his cheek, that you need to figure out a way to talk to your dad. You cannot... Listen to me, Nick. You cannot discard him. I know his reaction was violent and that there's a very slim chance that he would ever come to accept this, us. But you still need to give it a try. I'm sure he misses you. Well, he shows that very well, I muttered, my tone more vindictive than I'd like it to be. Nick, Mack chided. Whatever, eat. You need to take your medicine. After dinner, Mack asked how I'd returned home. He had taken the car with himself, although he dropped me off at the school. I didn't have any other option but to either book a cab or take the bus. But when I told him that I took neither transport, he looked at me in surprise. Did you walk? Are you silly? I asked and rolled my eyes. Jason gave me a ride. Oh, he muttered and poked his tongue against his cheek. He sounds like a nice man. He is, I replied, and smiled a little, initially oblivious about his tone. It was him who'd asked if I needed a ride, honestly, and I thought, well, if this is how I save money, then why not? Is he handsome? Is he... Mack, what are you thinking? When I turned to him, I couldn't help but immediately notice the furrow between his brows. Mack, it was just about giving me a ride, that's it. Okay, he replied. Geez, I just asked because he sounds like a nice man. Well, what's that got to do with anything with how he looks? I was just curious, he replied, and dropped down on the bed. Nick, I'm glad you're making friends with people your age. It's important. You're 28 after all. This is how it works out. Social interactions in life, I mean. But I knew he didn't only mean that. A few days later, one of the major issues that Mack and I often faced was the giant issue of the age gap. He was 14 years older than me, and even when we tried not to focus on it, it ended up creating trouble between us. It would usually start with him mentioning one of my younger colleagues, then appreciating him for his kindness and compassion before delving into inner musings that would be way too obvious for me to ignore. I wouldn't exactly say Mack was insecure about this particular part of our relationship, but that he is very aware of it. The more aware he was of it, the more he believed that I deserved someone younger and someone full of life. I would then assure him that I loved him and that it was amazing the way it was, and then it would return to normal. It didn't happen a lot, but every couple of months I would have to be prepared for it. It wasn't annoying, but it sometimes fractured my belief in a stable relationship. I had grown to respect my relationship with him, and that belief felt threatened each time he talked about a man of my age who'd be suitable as my boyfriend. Right after that evening conversation, Mack said that my dad wouldn't have reacted the way he did if my boyfriend was younger. I told him that wasn't the correct assumption. If he got upset because he thought you were forcing yourself on me, there's a good chance he would have thought the same with another man. I turned to look at him. And honestly, Mack, we know it wasn't because of that. So we know it's because I'm older. It's because you're his best friend, I said, a little annoyed now. Okay, that makes sense, he murmured, as if we hadn't discussed this part already. How about you tell me how the cookies turned out to be? Delicious, I replied, and put one in my mouth. I smiled at him. I don't want to upset you, he confessed. I'm glad you tell me whatever that goes in your head. Well, I'm glad you listen to me. I grabbed his hand in my own and watched him struggle with the ingredients and the recipe with only one free hand. Each time he messed up a detail or two, I couldn't help but laugh loudly. Honestly, I was glad that we reconciled so easily. I couldn't really imagine a life without him. I had spent 6 years with him, in secret at first, but after my dad found out about us, we didn't really need to be as secretive anymore. A few days ago, I'd informed a few of my friends about my relationship with him. 3 of them seemed alright with it, but one didn't really hide their fascination and their distaste. It was a unique experience to be subjected to that kind of mixed emotions. In the meantime, at Mack's insistence, I decided to contact my dad. He didn't pick up my calls, but he did read my messages when I texted him that I wanted to talk to him. I didn't want our relationship to have a bitter ending. I wanted my dad back. But a few days later, that wasn't the only problem that I was going to face. A few days later. I guess it was my fault. My friends insisted they wanted to meet my boyfriend, and feeling accepted for the first time in the longest time, I decided that sounded like a good idea. I convinced Mack that we needed to spend some time with my friends. He seemed reluctant with his still healing bruises, but I promised that my friends wouldn't mind. I look like a gangster, he muttered and pushed some hair over his forehead. For a man of his age, not only he looked incredibly handsome, but also had, well, a good amount of hair. It was one of the things that attracted me to him so much. He believed in self-care. Well, my gangster, I replied and clicked my tongue with a small grin. Oh God, you did not just say that. You know what? Can you say that again so I could record it? Nope, I replied and popped the word in my mouth. Let's go. Are you getting late? Yes, sir. From that interaction and Mack's interest in the meeting, I thought the rest of the evening would pass just as coolly. But luck wasn't on my side. My dad replied, Nick, I need some time, alright? Don't rush me through anything. Maybe that didn't really sit well with me, or maybe his reply didn't seem very hopeful either. Whatever the reason might have been, the night ended badly. Well, not exactly the night, but the later days. Trusting my friend, Mack and I had gotten shit-faced, and it was our number one mistake. Mistake number 2 was to make out in front of a bunch of strangers I called my friends. When I woke up the next day, my timeline was flooded with notifications and several posts on my name. Mack wasn't on Instagram, and I knew I was glad about it. One of my friends had made a harmless joke-like post by posting a picture of Mack and me kissing and captioned it with such filthy words that the comments were equally filthy. It was still early in the morning, so when I called him to delete the post, he didn't pick it up. I knew he was probably dead asleep, but anxiety seemed to grip me by my throat. When Mack asked what happened, innocent looking, I couldn't stop myself from snapping at him. I knew my anger was directed at the wrong person, but I was also aware that his face wasn't visible in the picture. All the deranged comments were made on me. All people called Mack was a sugar daddy. What happened, Nick? Mack asked softly. I slapped the hand on my cheek as angry tears rushed down my cheeks. I showed him my phone and he frowned and cursed. How did this happen? This is not true. He read a few comments and cursed again. This is all false. Why are they writing it? I'm going to break his nose, I replied. Is it Joe? Why would he do that? He thinks everything's a joke, I barked, angry now. Nick, it's all right, baby. Come here. He opened his arms to welcome me in an embrace, but I wasn't sure I wanted to be anywhere near him. I was still upset, and although he hadn't done anything, I knew there was a little chance he could make it okay. But when he tightly hugged me again, I couldn't help but melt into his arms. It's all false, he said again. None of this is true. You're a good person, Nick. We'll handle this together. But the post had gone viral in our little community, and the people who knew me seemed to be laughing at me behind my back. Because they didn't know the other man was Mack, they left him alone. It was during this time when my dad messaged me to ask if I was all right. He still hadn't called me, but he had messaged me to ask that. I called him and he thankfully picked it up. Dad, I said, sobbing a little. Nick, what have you done? He then said people around him kept asking if he knew what his son was doing, kissing men much older than himself. I felt hurt for him and apologized for everything. What happened? Why would your friend say something like that? You know how wrong that sounds. Joe had long since deleted the post and filled my DMs with apologies, but I didn't care about him at this moment. He had done enough damage. It wasn't me, Dad, I replied. He just posted it. Oh, Nick, my dad said. It's all right. Are you all right? My dad didn't leave a single hint that he had forgiven me, but the fact that he had talked to me to make sure I was all right meant something. I informed Mack about it, and he seemed happy to hear it. The next day, when he returned home from the office, he told me that my dad had sat beside him during the lunch break and even broached a few conversations to ask if we were doing all right. Most of his attention was on you, though, Nick. He said sorry, but he also said that he didn't feel sorry for hitting me. He believed I groomed you. He smiled wryly. You haven't, I replied. Your dad doesn't know that, baby. He pushed a few fringes behind my ear and looked into my eyes. It's time you talk to him, Nick. He clearly misses you, and I'm sure apologies are on the way. A few days later, I was upset, my dad began. It looked wrong. He started after a moment of break. With him all over you. It just looked very wrong, Nick. I got so scared I couldn't help but do that. And then you told me you two are dating, and can you imagine how shocking that must have been for me? I looked down at my lap. I'm sorry, Dad. He sighed and sat in front of him. What happened at school? I shrugged. I lost my job, I replied. They don't want anyone with my reputation around the kids. They're worried I'd influence them or something. That's wrong, he said. You haven't done anything. Newsflash, Dad. No one cares. He leaned against his chair. I'm sorry I hurt you, Nick. You should know I love you. And I love you, Dad. How did it begin between you two? Although he looked like that was the last thing he wanted the answers to, I decided to come clean once and for all. At the end of it, although not completely relaxed, he seemed a little relieved. I'm glad you weren't young. Too young, he added and rubbed his forehead. Why him, Nick? Why him? I knew he didn't want an answer to that. It sounded like a rhetorical question. He's good to me, Dad, I replied. I do not doubt that, he replied and sighed again. Come see me someday with him. Introduce him as your boyfriend. I couldn't help but smile at that. I will, Dad. Thank you. He nodded and leaned against his chair again. It'll be all right. As long as we're together. It'll be all right, I finished for him. He smiled and shooed me away. Sometime later, I was leaning against Mack. He was grabbing me around my waist, and I couldn't help but look up into his eyes. He wants to meet you as my boyfriend. Are you sure you wouldn't beat me again? I would have thought that he was worried if not for the small laugh he soon let out after. I rolled my eyes up at him and promised that my dad wouldn't hurt him again. Well, if this is how it gets better, then so be it. I kissed him on his mouth. I am sorry about the responsibilities. It will take me some time to find another job. Hey now, he rubbed his hand over my hair. It's all right. Don't rush. You don't want to end up with judgmental people again. Yeah, I wryly smiled and kissed him again. I love you. I love you too. Your bruises have gotten better. He touched a tender one. I hope so. I couldn't help but grin up at him. The dinner with Dad went well. He didn't seem very keen on the idea of seeing his best friend with his son, but he looked like he would make an effort to come to accept us. During one of these days, Dad even formally apologized to Mack about the beating. Thankfully, Mack and he seemed to return to their usual bantering ways, and it was good news to me. When I was sure things were getting better there, I decided to inform my other friends and family members. Most of them had already known about it from the particular post, but, well, it was nice to tell them Mack was my boyfriend. The end. Have you ever felt attracted to someone way older than you? If yes, then tell us how it went in the comments. Thanks for watching. Consider subscribing to become part of our Rainbow Force, and stay wholesome.